If not, please correct me. Xyzzy, I think it's pronounced another way, the magic word that changed everything.
Yes, hello, it was, yes, almost right. It's Gerli.
Almost right. Oh, okay.
It's all right, don't worry. So, hello everyone.
Hi.
I will share my screen. So, yeah, my name is Damiano Gerli. I am a gaming historian and freelance journalist. And today I would like to talk to you about the first magic word in video games, which is, of course, Xyzzy, or XYZZY, as you like to pronounce it. So when did it first appear? It actually appeared in 1976, and that's a long time ago, in Adventure, which was the first actual text adventure game. It was developed by Will Crowther, and he designed Adventure to actually be a recreation of the Mammoth Cave system in Kentucky that he had explored with his wife. And he developed the game to also be a way of reconnecting with his daughters. He had recently divorced. So of course, the game would also allow, in a way, kids to actually interact with it. So we will see how actually the magic word comes into play here. So usually you would call Adventure the first textual adventure game, but it's actually not. That honor goes to 1974 Castle by Peter Langston. But Castle was only on mainframe, and it was recently discovered after years of being lost. So again, Adventure is the one that you would say it's most culturally relevant for for generic discussions on adventures. So of course, Adventure was converted for many on computers of the time. So from 1976 until 1980, it also inspired Scott Adams to found Adventure International, which will later release adventure games important like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And so, what is Xyzzy? Xyzzy, as mentioned, is a magic word that the player could find on a wall and would allow them to skip back and forth between the cave and the house where the treasures can be dropped for points, because that was actually the point of Adventure, finding treasures and getting them back to the house. So in a way, it is a magic word, but it's also a cheat code, of course, because it was a way to help his daughters and future players as well to skip a substantial portion of the game. So while the word appears to have no meaning, and Crowther himself said he basically made it up, he actually thought of a word beginning with X because he wanted to work at Xerox, something like that. But some have actually theorized that Xyzzy is a reference to the mnemonic trick of the same name that is used by mathematicians or anyone using math to remember the formula to actually solve cross products. And I will say nothing else because I suck at math. And something interesting about, we mentioned Adventure being converted for a lot of home computers. You actually also got a conversion on the Atari 2600 in 1980 by Warren Robinett. It was actually the first time that a textual adventure was converted to an action style. As you can see, it features graphics, well, primitive graphics, of course, but it was the first time that a developer actually tried to transform a textual adventure into something else. And he actually, Robinett added actually interesting new features, like dragons that you had to kill, puzzles that you actually had to solve, and keys to be found, doors to be opened. So it's actually recognized as the first action adventure game that we ever got in the history of video games. And interestingly enough, Adventure for Atari is also remembered because it featured a quite famous Easter egg, because of course there was no Xyzzy for obvious reason, because there was no keyboard on the Atari, at least not one that you could interact with Adventure. And there was an Easter egg and a room where the developer actually left credits to himself. So a room that shows the text developed by Warren Robinett. And at the time, this was a big thing because, of course, credits were not really a thing in 1980. So, it was a way for a developer to leave a trace of himself. So Xyzzy, of course, came to be almost instantly culturally relevant. And how is it pronounced? I wrote here, and that's of course debatable, but I will say Xyzzy is fine. And as you can see here in the picture, actually several people went went exploring the Mammoth Cave system and actually found several real-life places that were actually reproduced by Crowder in the game. And this one right here, this photo in the here below, is actually two Cave Research Foundation members that are standing in front of the wall, that the real-life wall that in the game you're supposed to actually use a magic word to then be transported back to the house. So that's also interesting. So right away, the word enters the culture, and of course, first entered the world of video games, and of course, Textual Adventures right away. So Zork, another really famous series of Textual Adventures, actually, of course, used a text parser and actually answered when the player used Xyzzy, and the usual reply was, as you can see, a hollow voice says "fool," because of course it was the wrong game to use it in. So yeah, that was a kind of a humorous reference because Zork was more humorous than adventure. And even way past the days of Textual Adventures, several even recent video games like Deus Ex or Minecraft still actually feature references to Xyzzy, and some games it is actually used as a cheat, for example, Road Rash. And the usual reply to Xyzzy in several video games, and as you can see, we will see later, even more than video games, would be "nothing happens," because that was the reply that was given when the player tried to use the wrong magic word. So again, Xyzzy enters popular culture, and the magic word soon become the very first computer nerd joke back in the 80s. So it was, of course, the word that many nerds used to be instantly, recognized between themselves. And of course, when those nerds actually began working as engineers and actually entered the world of developing software, Xyzzy, of course, was a big thing. Xyzzy became almost a standard Easter egg that you could find almost everywhere. And I've put some example, for example, software for satellites, and firmware printers, operating system, and even Minesweeper in Windows up until I think XP actually used Xyzzy again as a cheat code that you could actually use to predict where the mines were in the game. So again, was important for several years, and even beyond that, still in some other application, it is still very much a thing. For example, apparently Google programmers seem to be great fans of adventure, and one model of the Chromebook actually would display a joke blue screen when Xyzzy was used. And even Gmail, I think to this day, can still replies to Xyzzy if when connected via IMAP. And again, of course, it replies with "okay, nothing happens." So again, that's that's a reference that everyone uses. And going ahead, looking at how magic was used in early video games, of course, many of those games that use magic actually use the concept of mana, which is a word that actually comes, if you can actually believe that, from the Polynesian branch of the Austronesian language family. Wow, I can't believe I actually said that correctly. And mana actually means supernatural power, at least as a general concept. And mana actually first appeared in the psychedelic counterculture and then made the leap to the world of fantasy books. And it is most strongly referenced in The Magic Goes Away by Larry Niven, who was actually published 4 years before Dune. And the concept of mana, it was not actually featured in the first version of Dungeons and Dragons, because the original game book mentioned just spell points, but it was actually implemented later, again, because of the influence of The Magic Goes Away and of course many other publications that use the concept of mana. In video games, Dungeons and Dragons appeared very early, around 1974, 1975, but of course there were very primitive versions of that, they're very primitive sorts of RPGs. So again, the magic system is, of course, primitive as well. It's used almost like consumables, so a bit like a potion. So you would collect a spell and then use it, and that spell would be lost. So that would disappear. And the first Ultima games that I actually mentioned before in the chat use spells very much in the same way. So Akalabeth or Ultima 1 or Ultima 2 did this, and Ultima 3 was actually the first one in the series to have a kind of a functional spell system. And of course, spell user actually had MP, so that would translate to magic points. And Final Fantasy in 1987, sorry, would also follow suit. So again, using magic points. And then actually came Dungeon Master in the same year, 1987, that actually explained that the M in MP actually stood for mana. And that was, of course, the moment that mana became a popular concept in many other RPGs and other adventure games, other games. But let's look at the magic users in video games. So one, of course, big series of adventure games in the early 80s and well beyond that was the King's Quest series by Sierra. Actually, online systems that then became Sierra Online, then became Sierra Entertainment, blah, blah, blah. The protagonist is not Sir Graham, is not a magic user. Magic plays quite a big role in the plot. For example, in the first game, actually in the fourth version of the first game, where the plot was kind of enriched and enlarged, the land of Daventry is in trouble because the magic items have been stolen by the evil witch. So again, without magic, the kingdom does not function. So again, your objective, Sir Graham's objective, was to get back the magic items. And as you can see, there's also many elements taken from fairy tales, like the magic beanstalk that Sir Graham has to climb to reach the land of the clouds, and there were giants and all of that. And of course, later at the end of the game, Sir Graham became, of course, King Graham. And looking at another series from Sierra, that's Hero's Quest, or what is known currently as Quest for Glory, for, copyright reason on Hero's Quest. The player could actually play as a magic user. There were 3 classes to choose from, but that did not really reflect into such a big distinction into the gameplay, because there were several things that were cut because the development was running into overtime. So the original plan was actually to be almost a full-fledged role-playing game, so featuring different races and even female characters to choose from. And the magic user would actually have a separate storyline with distinct puzzles that you would actually use mana and spells to solve, but most were cut from the original game. And here pictured, you can see Erasmus, which is a recurring character in the series in Quest for Glory. And of course, is as you can see, quite a whimsical character. It's quite a bit strange. And also originally, the magic user in the game was supposed to have a familiar, quite like Erasmus has, but that was cut because, again, the development was running into overtime. Looking at something a bit different, Simon the Sorcerer is a 1993 point-and-click adventure game that then got a sequel, actually, unfortunately, more than one sequel. It was developed by brothers Mike and Simon Woodruff. As opposed to the usual story of magic, Simon is just a normal teenager transported into this world of magic and monsters, and he's actually tasked with becoming a wizard because he's supposed to save one, which is Calypso. And the series was, of course, developed to be kind of a humorous take on fantasy, on magic, and the usual roles of the wizards and the dwarves and all of that. And the big thing, of course, was that Simon himself is not a sorcerer in the game. He can't actually cast spells, but he's just a snot-nosed kid who actually just wants to go back home and doesn't really care about anything other than himself. So that was a different take on the usual story of the wizard and the narrative arc of actually having to save the princess, or in this case the old wizard Calypso. And looking at another peculiar representation of wizards, Spellcasting is a series of adventure games, textual adventure games developed by Legend Entertainment, and they were actually developed to feel and to play a bit like classic American college comedies in video game form. So it was basically like, if you think about Animal House or Porky's, the classic American college movies from the 80s, with Harry Potter mixed in. So it's kind of a strange mix, but that's what they were going for, because the protagonist was actually a very promising student in the art of magic, but he has quite a big sex drive. So of course he's distracted all the time, but actually having to, bring the girls to bed and all that. So of course that's what usually happens. And Going beyond adventure games, of course, many other games would also start to feature magic. And for example, first-person shooters, while at first, of course, they would feature sci-fi themes and horror themes and Nazi themes as well, would later join the fray with games like Heretic and Exen, and of course, also later The Wheel of Time, which was actually based on Robert Jordan's series of books. And talking about strategic titles very quickly, also, there were a few fantasy strategic titles in the early 80s, but did not really feature a spell system or anything that complicated. We would actually start to see that in Warcraft, Warcraft 2, and also, well, there were, priests having some kind of spellcasting ability, and of course, Age of Wonders or Total Annihilation Kingdoms. So that also later became very much a thing. And going back to Xyzzy for a moment, I mentioned that it's a magic word, but it's also basically a cheat code. So that's interesting in a way to look at a cheat code as a sort of magic. And I think in the 80s, it really did feel like that. Well, there were several examples, of course, of cheats in the 80s. I mean, I'm not sure that you would actually call Xyzzy the first ever video game cheat. I don't know about that. Probably it is, but, not 100% sure. But still, it is among the first, and there were others like, in Manic Miner, you could actually put in the driver license of the developer to activate cheats, and of course the Konami code that everyone remembers that allowed the player in several games by Konami to actually access cheat codes. But most interestingly, on the Commodore 64, there were several instances where the player could actually break the game by pressing break. And you could actually interact in a way via poke and peek commands with the game and try many things with it that you could actually discover cheats, discover weird things happening, sort of a bit like casting a spell in a way. And also here shown are many, it's called trainers actually, that pirates, when they cracked the game, pirates or crackers, as you would call it, would actually feature in the games themselves to actually, help the players, because, at the time, the difficulty in Commodore 64 games from the 80s was quite high. So of course, trainers were very much needed sometimes to even finish the game. And of course, later cheats became something else. And for example, we can look at Game Genie, again, referencing a kind of magic that the player could use. And as you can see, it was something that you would stick directly on your Nintendo cartridge on the NES, but it was produced for several other consoles as well. But let's say the original is for NES in 1990, and it was plugged directly into the Nintendo, and it would allow the player to basically insert codes and to do lots of things. Most of them were cheats, but some games actually had weird cheats, like halfway cheats, like almost invincibility, or invincibility that just lasted like a couple levels. So it depended on the game. And some cheats actually allowed the player to access unreachable areas, or even features that were left normal gameplay. So it was even interesting from a kind of preservationist point of view, in that you could actually see beyond the game's code, again, something like very much a spell, I would say. And finally, of course, now cheats have become something very, very different in that, for example, if we look at the pay-to-win model, the player is allowed to skip a lot of boring tasks or boring sections of the game by just, paying, just giving money to the developers. But of course, cheats nowadays can also be seen as a kind of accessibility trick, let's say, in that, of course, they allow people that have problems with controls or games of high difficulty to actually make the combat system easier, or make the enemy slower, or, just having directly more health points. So I think this is also interesting. And I would like to close with a very short anecdote, personal anecdote about cheats. I remember it was in secondary school, I think. Many of my classmates used to pass around this booklet that had cheat codes for Mortal Kombat. And no one had any idea where the original booklet came from. It was kind of a mystery. No one knew. And of course, it was photocopied so many times that, of course, it was almost impossible to read. So again, it was very, very mysterious, and it was hard to read and even harder to decipher the cheat codes. So when you actually got one cheat code right, again, it felt like you had worked a magic. You had did something of a miracle, and it was incredible. So again, magic as a cheat, magic as an Easter egg, so many things. But you know, it's still nice to see, of course, lots of magic in video games and even in different forms. So that's it for me. And here you can find me on the genesistemple.com website if you want. And any questions, of course, available. And thank you for listening, of course.
Thank you very much for this